Today is June 11th, 2024. We are interviewing Philip Pendry. My name is Esther Finder. Mr. Pendry is in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I am in Henderson, Nevada, in the United States, and the language will be English. Thank you for speaking with us today. What is your name, sir, and can you please spell it?
I don't.
Your name, sir.
Oh, my name. You have to speak a bit loud. Philip Charles Pendry.
Could you spell that for me?
Phillip, Charles, Charles, Pendry, Pendry.
Thank you. Where were you born?
In England, in the UK, in London.
Has your family been there many generations?
Yes, many.
When were you born?
1927, January the 8th.
And how old are you today, sir?
96.
What was your father's name?
Roy Hatfield Pendry.
Where was he born?
In England. Oh no, he was born in Brooklyn, New York.
What work did he do?
He was a chef.
And your mother's name?
Teresa.
Where was she born?
In England, London.
And what work did she do?
Oh, she was helping my father.
What are some of your very earliest childhood memories?
My earliest childhood memories was when the war started in England, and my parents moved me to the outskirts of London to stay with my grandparents because it might be safer, not too many bombs. But unfortunately, where I lived on the outskirts, the Germans dropped a landmine and blew the top of the houses off. And from that is my first memory of being in my grandfather's house. I don't remember anything before that even, but because of the explosion, I always suffered a bad impediment. I stuttered quite badly until I was 15 because of that.
What religious traditions did your family observe?
What?
Religious traditions.
Oh, well, as a child, religion never came into it because, as I say, I was only, 10 or 11 years old, and I don't remember anything before that at all. All I remember was the explosion in my grandfather's house, and that's where my memory begins, unfortunately.
Did you get medical care after that?
No, not at all. I just grew out of it until I was 15. I had this stammer, which was quite pronounced.
You started to tell us how your life changed with the beginning of the war.
Well, as I say, I was in my grandfather's house, or in grandmother's house, and the landmine came off, and they decided to, the government that is, decided to ship all the children out of London into safe rural areas. And the only thing I remember was they put me on a train with an outfit called Pied Piper, in which about 1 million children, I think 800,000 from London alone, were put into the rural districts of England so as to escape the bombing of London.
What do you remember about leaving?
Leaving, I remember getting on a train, and the only thing I had to carry was a little cardboard box, and in it was a gas mask. And that's all I carried on a train, and there was a label pinned to my jacket that gave my name and date of birth. And from that, we were just shipped to the countryside. I remember getting on a train with no parents at all, because my parents were in London and the train was out of town. I think we got on a train in St Albans or somewhere outside of London. And I was with maybe, if you go to Google, you'll see all of the pictures of all the kids being put on a train. And the only thing they're carrying is this little cardboard box with a gas mask in it.
Do you remember how it was explained to you that you needed to get on this train and leave?
No, there was no explanation. We were told to get on the train, and we were herded literally like sheep. We had there was a couple of government people with us, because the Pied Piper people were desperate to get the children out of London and away from the bombing.
What can you tell us about the atmosphere of the children?
What was the attitude of my parents? Did you say?
Ask the atmosphere. How did the children react? Were they crying? Was it an adventure?
Nobody was crying. It was like a day's outing. We were at that age, we were all getting on a train to go somewhere. We didn't know where we were going anyway. We just got on the train, and there was some government nurses there to help us in case we needed anything. But that's all I remember.
And where were you sent?
I was sent to a little village in Lincolnshire called Welby. That's in the Fens, in about near the coast anyway. And I was stationed with a woman called Olive Gelbert, who looked after her husband, and they put me into a small house in Welby. And the only thing that I remember was that we had no electricity, no running water. It was, as I say, it was like going back 50 to 100 years, because this was real village living. There was no, as I say, there was no telephones, no electricity, outside toilets. It was primitive.
Did they have classes or some kind of educational program for the children?
Yeah, we had a school. There was a village school, and all the people were in it from 5 to 15, and there was one teacher that was for the whole 5 to 15 class. It was a very basic education.
Can you give us a sense of how the children were reacting to this? Were many of the children homesick?
Well, as I say, there were children in the village, and there was no other people from the Pied Piper. All the children in the village were from the local people, so that's the only people I had to mix with. And as I say, there was no newspapers. There was only one shop that was a post office, so you couldn't go and buy anything or do anything. I think one bus came through every day from Grantham, which was a city about 5 miles away, and otherwise we were isolated.
Can It doesn't sound like you had much communication with your parents.
None at all, because, as I say, they were in London and I was in Welby. So, very, as I say, they couldn't phone me, or they didn't write. Both my parents were busy in London, and so I was there until I stayed in Welby until I was 15.
What would be a typical day for you?
A typical day for me, well, as I say, religion didn't come into it because Olive was Church of England, and so was her father. And I remember having to go to church every Sunday, and then in the evening go to a class with a deaconess. So I had no idea of what religion I was at the time, because, as I say, she was Church of England, and used to take me to church Sunday morning and in the evening. And I remember one of the jobs I had was to pump the organ in the church. Of course, they didn't have any electricity. But they did have electricity in the village. But unfortunately, we had two public houses, pubs, and they had electricity because they could afford it. Oh, by the way, as I said, we didn't have running water. There was a tap outside in which I think 4 of the small cottages we were in used to use the same tap. So we didn't get much bathing. We had to go out and buy buckets of water and bring them back to the house. And then in the summertime, I didn't go to school. My job was there was harvesting. We did all the things that people in the country do. They used to pay me £0.50 a week to lead a horse from the barn to the field to collect the wheats, and I would lead these big horses backwards and forwards, and that was my job. So it was enjoyable. And as I say, we had no idea of that was a war going on.
I have a couple questions to follow up on what you just said. Did you mention the name Olive?
Did I mention the name what?
Olive. You mentioned the name, and I didn't know who that was.
Oh, Olive was the lady I was staying with. Her name was Olive Gilbert. And she looked after her father, who was a labourer. So we had a labourer's cottage, which was, as I say, very sparse.
You also mentioned that you came with a box with a gas mask.
Yeah,
Clothing.
well, we never used them because the Germans didn't use gas. I remember taking it with me, and I don't even know what we did with it. I must have put it somewhere, and I never saw it again. The only reason I have it was when I got on the train carrying it, and then when I got to Welby, I must have put it somewhere, and I never saw the gas mask again.
That's fine. What did you do for clothing and shoes?
Well, she provided me with. We got clothes. I think the Salvation Army was there, and they supplied us with clothes. So we weren't short of anything anyway, as far as that concerned. And all the food was local. There were no shops in Welby. As I say, the only shop was a post office, which I could buy sweets at, and that's about it.
You mentioned you went to Church of England services.
Oh, yes.
Was your family Church of England, or was your family?
Oh, no. My real family were Jewish. But they were not practicing at the time because of the war.
Did you experience or witness any anti-Semitism?
No, none whatsoever. Because the children in the village, there was no anti-Semitism because they didn't know I was Jewish anyway. it didn't put it on the little label. I remember it was just my date of birth and name, but not my religion.
Is there anything else that you want to share about your time up until age 15? Any other memories come to mind?
Did I want to what? Share?
Is there anything else you wanted to share about your first 15 years of life, and then we'll go on to age 15 in a minute?
Well,
is there anything else that comes to mind?
When I was in the village, as I say, we went to school, and in the summertime, we didn't go to school. We worked on the farm. As I say, I was leading the big horses backwards and forwards, which I was paid half a crown for. And in about the second year I was there, they were making there was a film company, and they made a film there called Tawny Pipit about a lost bird. And instead of going to school, I was fascinated by, it was about, a mile out of town. So I used to get on a bicycle and ride and watch them making the film. Now, as you know, there was conscription in England. So everybody at the age of 17 was called up. So there was a tremendous shortage of people on the set. And I'd been watching them make this film for about a week. And somebody came up to me, and I was, I think, 14 and a half. And they said, "Do you want a job?" And I thought, yeah, why not? So they said, "What would you like to do?" And they gave me a choice. And I saw this camera, and I said, "Oh, I'd like to be on the camera." So they gave me a union card, and I became what's known as a clapper boy. There's a picture of me there standing in front of all the crew with the clapperboard, and my job was to put a board in front of a camera and shout 368, take one, and clap a board. And I got this job at the age of 15, which was amazing, right? They paid me £7.10 a week, but not while I was in Welby, because they were only there for about another 3 months. They moved then, the film unit moved back to a place called Pinewood Studios in Denham. And they said, did I want to join them? So I was 15 years old, and I didn't ask my parents' permission. And I told Olive I was going to go to London and as a camera assistant, as a clapper boy, and join this film unit, which I thought was much more exciting than having to go to school in Welby.
Were you able to work your way up in this industry?
Yes.
How did you do that?
Well, by the time I was 17, I was a camera assistant as a focus puller. So I'd worked my way up. I worked on some very well-known films as a clapper boy and as a camera assistant, right? And as I said, I was only, 16 years old. So by that time, I was mixing with grown-ups, and we were on location in army camps and officers' quarters. So at 16, I was mixing totally with grown-ups. I became quite a smoker, and at 16, in the evening, of course, the older ones used to drink, so I would join them. So at about 16, I was almost an alcoholic.
You mentioned a moment ago that at age 17, young men had to...
Well, you had to register.
Had to register, okay. Can you tell me what happened with you?
Well, I had to go before a board. And as I said, I did have one connection in London with a cousin of mine, Lily Davis, who was the only person I knew because my parents at that time had moved to somewhere up north. And they said, well, you're going to go, they'll give you a medical and they'll ask you what religion you are. And they said, if you say you're Jew.
Could you try again?
What's that?
Hi, George. How can I help?
How can you help? Oh, how can she help? She said, well, they're going to ask you your religion.
To know Siri, that
Oh,
I'm sorry?
I think we need to cut and figure out what's happening in the background.
Yeah, Siri is, okay, I'm gonna have to stop, sorry.
Okay, we're back. Sorry about that technical issue. You were telling us about registering for the military service, and you were saying that something about religion, and that's where we had to stop. So can you please continue?
Well, my cousin Lily, who was the only person in my family who seemed to be religious, and she said, if they're going to ask you what religion you are, and if you say you're Jewish, they'll put you in the Jewish brigade and give you a clerical job. And she said, because the British are not stupid, because at that time they could see the writing on the wall. They could see Palestine was going to become Israel. And if you were Jewish, you would go into the army and you'd learn things like laying landmines, and you'd learn a lot of military things, which the British didn't want the men who they thought eventually would go to Israel when it was formed, because, as I say, the British could see the writing on the wall. So I said I was Church of England. So I didn't get put in the Jewish brigade, but I did meet, while I was in the army, a number of, and all the clerks in the offices were Jewish, because they, as I said, operating in Palestine at that time was the Stern Gang, and they had been using British recruits in Palestine for the Stern Gang, and they were giving the British a lot of trouble even then. So they had to be careful, and they were, as I say, the British were basically colonialists, right? They couldn't see giving up anything, India, Palestine, anywhere, and they wanted to hang on. So they were very careful in the selection of people that they trained to become any kind of military problem.
You brought up two things I want to get a little more information on. When exactly did you join the military?
When did I join the what?
The military. When did you become an active member of the military?
Oh, well, I had to do my basic training in England, and I had to go to a regiment, which was the Manchester Regiment, so that stuck with me. I hear music. Anyway, it stuck with me. And then, of course, the army, being the army, they had seen I had been a camera assistant, so they didn't associate that with the movies. They associated it that I knew camera work. And they put me, I became a sergeant, and I was stationed with the Allied War Crimes Commission in Bad Oeynhausen in Germany. And that's how I became a sergeant.
Yeah, do you know when you became a sergeant and you got this position? Can you give me a date?
Well, I was in the army from late 44 to 48. So just at the end of the war. I remember VE Day and VJ Day quite distinctly.
I'll ask you about that in a minute. You mentioned the Stern Gang. Can you please elaborate on that?
Would I elaborate on what?
The Stern Gang. You mentioned the Stern Gang. I need you to explain what you're referring to.
I didn't quite get what you said there. Something day.
No, Stern Gang. You mentioned Palestine?
Oh, the Stern Gang. Well, I mean,
Please elaborate.
by that I heard the news, we read the papers, we watched newsreels, we saw everything that was going on, and we could see what was going on it was Palestine at the time, right? And it was Palestine until almost 47, 48, when the Americans recognized Palestine and it became Israel.
Can you tell us who or what was the Stern Gang?
Did my parents?
No. Who or what was the Stern Gang?
What the Stern Gang? It was according to the British, it was a terrorist organization. I mean, they blew up the King David, amongst other things, and they were a thorn in the side of the British in Palestine at the time. And as I said, they didn't want anybody with military experience joining them, or the British didn't want them joining them because they could see the writing on the wall, right?
I'm going to ask you about VE Day in a minute, but you mentioned that you signed up as Church of England. Did you witness any anti-Semitism in the military?
No, because they didn't know I was Jewish. So,
I understand that. Did you witness it anywhere else in any other capacity?
yeah, obviously. Yes, it was, I mean, it was quite rampant. There was none in the film industry itself, absolutely none. And none as a child and in the film industry, I never witnessed any anti-Semitism at all. It only occurred to me that there was anti-Semitism when I went to join the army, and I could hear remarks by other people in the army about Jews, right? I never said anything because that would give away and I, as a matter of fact, I didn't look Jewish, so they didn't associate with me with being Jewish.
Can you tell us, please, about your duties and your responsibilities in the Army? As a sergeant, what did you do?
When you speak to me, I think you have to speak a bit slower and a bit louder because I'm missing a couple of words.
I will repeat. What were your duties or responsibilities as a sergeant in the military? What was your job?
In the army, our job was quite, I worked, as I say, they gave me a camera and I worked with a pathologist called Major Mant, and our job was quite insignificant because we were given, in this unit, the majority of the people were officers. They were Canadian, Polish, American, not Russian, obviously. But our job was to look at prisoners of war that had escaped from POW camps. If they'd been captured by the army, they were put back into the camps. If they were captured by the Gestapo, as you saw in the famous film Stalag 3, they were shot or put into concentration camps. That's about, I think there was about 30 of them escaped from Stalag 3. And our job was to go around the camps to identify the POWs that had been murdered by the Gestapo. And as I say, it was quite a strange thing because we had to visit, we had permission to go to all the camps, Buchenwald, the ones in Poland, and we then had to, now the Germans were very particular. They didn't put the soldiers, the ones they shot, in the gas chamber. They buried them. And the the Germans, as per usual, kept extremely accurate records, so we could dig up the remains of what we could find. And my particular job was to photograph the remains so we could send the identification that Major Mant could identify them, and we would send them to Nuremberg, because we were going to nail the Germans on breaking the Geneva Convention, which unfortunately was minimal, because, as you know, during the war, there was 6 million Jews were murdered, and nearly 72 million people died. So looking for maybe 100 POWs that had escaped and had broke the Geneva Convention was a minimal effort. I think it was a waste of time, because what I did, the pictures I got were just bones, and they're in the department in London, which my older daughter got copies of. But the thing is, it was a kind of a waste of time as compared with the major crimes that I don't think what we contributed never went to Nuremberg, but there were some later trials in which the Geneva Convention was called into, and they did actually nail half a dozen people that had murdered these POWs. As I say, the Geneva Convention was a load of crap. It was dated, I think, by a bunch of Swiss bureaucrats. I think it was in, I've got it down somewhere, it was in, I think, about 1894. They decided to bring in the Geneva Convention, which was absolutely pointless, because in those days it was 1894, and these bureaucrats put it together, and there was no modern war. It was just to protect the officer class, which was ridiculous. It did come. If you ever saw the bridge over the River Kwai, Alec Guinness quotes the Geneva Convention to the Japanese commander that the officers will not do manual labor. This was in the Geneva Convention. So at those times, it was just to protect the upper class. It was also made in those days to protect the wounded. But as I say, nobody stood by the Geneva Convention, and everybody broke it when they wanted to. As I say, it was never brought up. It was just a fly in the ointment as far as the punishment went.
In the process of doing your job and visiting the camps, what kinds of things did you learn about how the POWs were treated?
Well, visiting the camps was the worst part of the job, because I was embarrassed. We would attend a camp, and there would be people there that, as I say, almost dying, and there we were, fully clothed. We'd had 3 square meals a day, and it was embarrassment, because you couldn't do anything. You couldn't communicate with these people. And as I said, our job was not to help them, but to look for these graves that the POWs had been buried in. But to protect myself from it, I mean, I looked on it as the kind of the theater of the absurd, because when we went to the camps, I had a still camera, a Rolleiflex, and I used to hold it up to my face, and that kind of hid the reality of what was going on. You put the camera down, you saw the misery. You put the camera up, and it was a buffer between you and reality. And inasmuch, I suppose, I never suffered PSTD, whatever they call it now, because I managed to use the camera as a barrier between me and reality.
Can you please tell us which camps you were visiting?
Which camp?
Which camps?
The one,
Remember?
well, I visited the one in Poland with the big sign, freedom, something or other. I also visited it again during the Eichmann trial in Israel. I went back there again. So that was my second visit because I covered the Eichmann trial in Israel. And they didn't have, it was not only the main camps that the Germans ran, they had about 100 of these camps. Basically, they weren't in Germany, they were basically in Poland. And we had travel permission to go anywhere we liked to look for these graves that we could dig up and identify and eventually nail them on breaking the Geneva Convention, which was pointless.
Were you looking only for British POWs?
No, we were looking for any Allied, but not Russian, obviously. We were, the ones that suffered the most were the Americans, because on their dog tags, it was Jewish. So a lot of American soldiers got nailed if they were captured if they were captured during the breakthrough in France. They suffered. I mean, we were basically looking for the British soldiers, but we would come across Americans as well, as I say, but no Russians because there was too many of them. And they were treated completely different anyway.
In your memory of the camps, how did some of them compare to others of them? Did you see many patterns of similarity, or were there big differences in the camps?
Would I see different what?
When you think back to the many camps that you visited,
Yes.
were they very similar, or were the camps very different?
Well, as I said, they had hundreds of camps. These camps were not in Germany, they were in Poland, so they would be small ones without names. And we went all over looking for these, not only we were looking in France as well. We went to France to look for things. We went to Poland. I don't think I don't remember any of them in Germany. They were all in foreign, those, as I say, they were all, the ones that we visited were all in Poland.
When did you personally first realize the enormity of the genocide of the Jews? When did that
Well,
realization?
we obviously read about it at the end of the war. They had the newsreels and the newspapers. So we didn't get any realization of the state, because I think the British didn't bomb the camps, or they didn't bomb the things. I think nobody in England at the time realized how bad it really was. It was only after VE Day that it came to light that this enormity was there. I think the Americans realized it. The Brits or the French didn't.
given your religious background, even though you were not practicing, how did this hit you when you finally understood that millions of Jews had been killed?
Well, the trouble was, as I said, I didn't, being Jewish myself, it obviously affected me, but I can't really come to terms with it of how I felt at the time, because it was, as I said, I was embarrassed by seeing all this and myself being, not part of it.
Can you please share your memories of VE Day?
Of VE Day? Yes. I was actually in France, and we were ecstatic about VE Day because that was the end of the European war. But again, in the back of our minds as soldiers, we weren't home free because there was still the Japanese, and we didn't know anything about the atom bomb. All we knew that we had defeated Germany, and there was still another war to fight. Our problem was, as ordinary soldiers, that we would get sent to fight the Japanese. We didn't know it would end so quickly because of the atom bomb. We were just scared. And then when VJ actually happened, that was a relief, because otherwise we had dreams of being sent to cover and fight in the Pacific, which we didn't want to do anyway.
You mentioned that your work did not play a big role in Nuremberg, but did you yourself go to Nuremberg at all during the trials?
No, not at all, because as I say, our contribution was so minimal that I don't think the Geneva came up during the Nuremberg trials. It was only afterwards. I mean, they were nailing these Germans for the death of 6 million Jews. A couple of dozen people breaking the Geneva Convention was hardly a matter of importance.
Do you have any other memories of your time in the military that you want to share with us?
Any other what? Memories?
Of your time in the military.
Yes. As I said, it was quite strange being in the military and being Jewish, but then not looking Jewish, and then being taken for Church of England. So I would come across quite a lot of anti-Semitism at the time, but basically it was religious upbringing that these people had. I'm sure as a child or as a baby, nobody grows up with anti-Semitism. What happens is that they're taught anti-Semitism through religion. That's Christian against Catholic, Shiite against Sunni. These, I think, as I say, the children grow into anti-Semitism by being taught by their parents. And and I think religion was one of the causes. I mean, one is amazed at the difference between wars, because there's the war in Ireland, which is Protestant against Catholic. That's been going on for 350 years, right? And they, as I say, they both worship the same God. So it's very difficult to come to any kind of reasoning as far as religion goes. Again, Shiite and Sunni, they believe in God. In Germany, as a matter of fact, if you had a job, we found that if you were any kind of government job, that's a postmaster or an army, you had to, Hitler made you had to swear to God to be in good with the Nazis. So everybody, in effect, had the same God, which was I always amazed that this non-existent person was there as a guidance for Muslims. I mean, the Muslims and Jews, they honor the same God. The Christians, all the religions seem to have God as a common denominator. I mean, if you look at an American dollar bill, what does it say on it? In God we trust. So I became very skeptical of religion. I'm in the what's his name? The comedian who is anti-religious. I found that I've covered about 31 conflicts, and the basis of these conflicts has always been religion, no matter what. I'm amazed that we are still fighting religious wars. And this grows up because everybody seems to have the same God. Can we cut for a second? I have to look up some notes that I don't have with me.
Rachel? Esther?
Yes.
Should we cut then?
Yeah, we can cut.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, we're back. You had asked for a break. You wanted to
that's
look
better.
something up.
I can hear her now.
Okay.
Yeah, when I left the army, my first job was with the Jewish National Fund. I made the first documentary in Israel in '48 called Ein Brera, There Is No Choice. And from there on, after making that was my first trip to Israel. There's been about 7 others since that I've covered every war there. But basically, I realized I was Jewish then, so my whole attitude kind of changed after that. And then I went into documentary filmmaking, and have since then covered about 30 or 40 conflicts. And as I say, the conflicts, as far as I'm concerned, the basis of them have been religion. Bill Maher, comes on every Friday night on HBO, he's anti-religious. He made a film called Religion, which I tend to move towards because I couldn't make any sense of all the wars that I'd covered and what they were for. If there hadn't have been religion, there wouldn't have been the wars. But I mean, ever since time immemorial, we've been at war. We seem to have just very short periods of peace in between wars. And as I say, having covered 31 of them, not wars, conflicts, because there's only 2 people have ever declared war. England declared war on Germany in '39, and Israel declared war on Hamas last year. So all the others have been conflicts, not wars. I mean, if you take wars, they've been going on since, the Crusades, 1096. That was the start of the Crusades. There's the 30-year wars in Europe. There's the Congolese War, which was called the Forever War. I know I covered the Congo, and that's been going on for 50 years. And it's one of the wars that's not covered now, but it's still going strong. Again, these are tribes of religious differences that have caused these wars, the same as Nigeria, the same as Cyprus, the Turks versus the Greek Cypriot Church, Algiers, the French Catholics versus the Muslims. All these conflicts, again, have been, the background to them has been religion. So you can imagine my reluctance to really sympathize with very religious people. I mean, the ultra-right in Israel at the moment firmly believes that Israel shouldn't exist, along with Hamas, right? So you get these differences of extreme religion, which are very difficult to follow.
When did you move to Canada and why?
Oh, I moved to Canada in 1952. I've lived, I didn't stay here long. I've lived in Tokyo, I've lived in Paris, and I've lived in London. So I've spent very, very little time. As I say, we go back to the beginning. I hardly knew my parents, to be quite honest. As a matter of fact, my father died in 1955. My mother died, I forget when, but I didn't have any relation at all with them at all. Because one, I was traveling, one, I was with the Pied Piper thing, then I was in the army, then I was working abroad, all that time. And so I had, as I said, very little conversations. I think one of the questions was, how did they meet? I never knew how they met, even. I hardly knew my father. So it was very difficult for me. The only relationship I had were two cousins called Davis, Lily and Paddy, and Lily was very religious, so I was very strong with her.
Just want to check, you were an only child?
Yes, the only child.
Have you spoken or written about your experiences?
Have I? Yeah, well, I've written a book called A Slightly Different Point of View. I'm putting together, a friend of mine's trying to put together a lecture tour for me. And I don't know, I've done a couple of interviews, one with CTV, basically talking about the same thing.
I would like to ask you to comment on some of the current conflicts. For example, Russia and Ukraine. You mentioned several things, but you didn't mention that one. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, very definite. Ukraine can't during the war, Ukraine, up to this time, can never make up its mind which side it's on. I mean, Stalin originally starved them to death in the 1930s. Then the Germans invaded and they fought the Germans, and then the Russians invaded and they fought then they fought back again, and they were working with the Germans. I mean, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the Ukraine, so I'm not particularly fond of the war there because I'm not sympathetic. I am sympathetic because they're fighting, but the Ukrainians can't seem to make up their mind which side they're on.
What are your thoughts about October 7th and the rise in anti-Semitism worldwide since then?
Well, recently it's been enormous because of the problem in Gaza. As I say, I've spent a lot of time in Israel, a lot of time. I've covered all the wars with Morley Safer for 60 minutes. There are a number of communities where Jews and Muslims live together. It's like in Ireland when the Catholic and Protestant, there were small points in Ireland where Catholics and Protestants lived together quite well. As I say, there are places in Israel where the Jews and Muslims get on. But I blame the press for this because they always look for a negative side towards any given situation. They never look for a peaceful side. As I say, what amazes me about Israel, the trouble is in Gaza, it's in Jerusalem, and it's up on the northern border. Haifa, which is a town where Jews and Muslims exist together completely still. Now, you never see any good stories about Haifa. They always pick on the negative side of a story because they know it will sell. This is why I don't trust news items now that they have commercials. I remember you could watch news at one time without having to watch a commercial. Now, of course, they sell the news on the action side, and of course the press themselves pick on what is basically going to get their viewership. And I think this is a mistake because I think we're backing all the wrong horses in this case. I think this is why Trump is so popular, because all they do is mention his name until you see nothing else but Trump, 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 and nothing else. And the same in Israel. As I say, all the negative stories get used. A perfect example of that was I was covering Cyprus between the Turks and the Greek Orthodox Church. And we were in Cyprus covering the war. And it was very, there was firing goes on. And one day we're in, I think, in La Masia, and we hear this fighting on the roof. And we hear this gunship, and we hear this fighting going on. So we run up these stairs, the camera crew and myself and the correspondent, and there is this Cypriot firing a gun on the roof against the Turks. By the time we get to him, he stops firing. And we said, "Why have you stopped firing?" He says, "Well, of course, if you want me to go on firing, you have to pay me," which is incredible. The correspondent said, "You must be mad. If we pay you, we are now going to be in deep trouble. Why do you want paying?" Well, it turns out that the man firing the gun used to be an editor at a news station. He says, "Of course, you'll film me firing a gun. This will go back to your station and they'll use it because as against the peaceful story, which you should be covering, they'll cover me firing a gun, which will get them viewership. And of course, they get viewership, their commercial rates will go up." He says, "That's why I want paying." So we never paid him and walked away from that situation. But this is the situation that, as I say, that we're in nowadays. The commercialism of the wars and the way that it's going. So it's impossible to, as I say, come to any reasonable doubt now about the validity of the news that you're listening to. What with AI saying they could falsify it, there's not many stations that you can switch to on television and you get the truth. All the same with the newspapers. I looked at the Guardian, which seems to be thing, and there's PBS in the States, which seems fairly accurate. But the other ones are guided by the amount of commercials that they can use during the newscasts. I know that's a bit convoluted, but forgive me.
No, it was terrific. You mentioned that you worked with Morley Safer in 60 Minutes.
Yes.
Now, you're from England. You spent a lot of time in Israel. You live in Canada. How did you connect with 60 Minutes and Morley Safer?
Morley used to be the Canadian broadcasting correspondent. I worked for the CBC in London when I went back there, and Morley worked originally for CBC before he went to 60 Minutes. And I worked with Morley for about 2 or 3 years. We covered Cyprus and the whole of Africa, and then he went back to 60 Minutes. Well, he wanted me, he said, well, I'd join him at 60 Minutes, but then I was offered a job by CTV in Tokyo, and I just got married, and my wife said, well, what should I do? She said, well, I think we should go to Tokyo, which was a big mistake, because if I'd have stayed with Morley, I'd have been considerably richer. Because he became one of the best correspondents on 60 Minutes. When he died, I gave the closing speech at in the Lincoln Center for Morley when he died. And they had a get-together for Morley. So I knew him very well.
Just a few more questions, sir. How do you think your experience in the English countryside when you were young impacted your life?
Well, as I say, it was very difficult because, as I say, it was like living a century ago. It was primitive, very primitive. As I said, no electricity, no running water, outside toilets, and it was strange. It was very strange. And until I was 15 and got the job as a clapper boy with a film unit, my experience in the country was, I say, not minimal, but I suppose it makes me very healthy because I didn't eat any of all the food I ate was homegrown. There was nothing, there was no canned food or food like that. So when I came out of the army, instead of going to visit my parents, I went straight back to Welby to see this woman that had looked after me when I was a youngster.
How do you think your work in the Army influenced the rest of your life?
Oh, the Army. It was strange, as I said. Being the people I worked with was a great pathologist, and as I said, it wasn't enjoyable, but it was a break, and to do all the things that I would never have done before, right? Or never had a chance to do. It was a wake-up call, the Army, as a matter of fact, because it was my first phase of anti-Semitism.
And how do you think that impacted your life?
Well, as I say, it turned me into being anti-religious in a great manner because, as I said, I had experienced all these conflicts being religious, and so at the moment I'm not practicing at all any religion because, as I said, I find it quite amazing that the majority of conflicts I've covered have been caused by religion, and it's been either tribe against tribe or or some very, very strange. But they all have, as I say, what amazes me is they have this problem of having God as the same kind of link to all religions, which I find very, very strange. That this unknown person up in somewhere in the distance they call God, who is revered by all religions, whether they're Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Protestant, Catholic, whatever it is, they all have this common denominator, which is God, which I find very hard to stomach. Even, as I say, on your dollar bill, it always says on America, I think it must be the only currency that has God on its currency. It says at the back of the bill, "In God we trust." But it's the same God that the Shiites and Sunnis trust, because I covered the war in Iraq and Iran. And that was between two religions, desperately.
Is there anything you want to add? Is there any unfinished business you'd like to take care of before we conclude?
Yes, in 1994, I made I was impressed in 94 in Toronto, the Jewish and Muslim holy days were almost in the same week. So they had a multinational gathering. And I found that after visiting all these countries, I didn't have time to study the language. It was take too long. But what I did understand is that I could associate music with these countries. So each country has a definite music. I got together half a dozen religions, but they were all musicians. And I made a film called One with Music, in which I had these religions practicing in Toronto, and then I took them to Israel, to Haifa, where they gave a concert. And this was the Buddhists. They were all different kind of religions. And we made this film called One with Music I think it was One with Music, I forget, it was 1994 or something, yes. And we came back with what we found was a link that they could all talk to each other through music. And we made this film showing how music kind of joined the different religions together. When we came back to Toronto, we had made the film. It was quite a good film. We tried to get our money back for it, because we'd been given the money to make the film from Jewish and Muslim sources. But we came back with the film, and the networks, all of them, said, well, why didn't you take the musicians down to Gaza or Jerusalem and get them being fired at? I said, well, that's not the point. The point was to show how music could join people together and not separate them. But the Infanada had started, and nobody was interested in the film itself, because it only showed, again, the press, again, the television stations. There wasn't any action in it. It was basically a film about peace and how music could join things together. So basically what I've done in past is everything I've really done has been associated with music. I was a great friend of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, who I knew personally, and they used music as a link the great conductor Barnum had an orchestra in Berlin that was made up of Palestinians. Again, using music as a bridge seemed to work.
I have to ask you how you met John Lennon.
In 1962, I was living in Japan, and I met Yoko Ono, and I rented a flat in Tokyo that belonged to Yoko Ono, and Yoko went back to London, and so did I. And she was always interested in photography, and she knew I was a cameraman. And in Tokyo, she had wanted to photograph people's bottoms, because you know how people moon people if they want to insult somebody. You know what mooning is. She said if we could photograph people's bottoms, we could do something peaceful. Well, we never got around to it, but when we went back to London, we decided to make a film with nothing else called People's Bottoms. It was called Film Number 4. It was very, very successful. We put an advertisement in the Times for people that wanted to come and have their rear ends photographed. So men or women, if you see, I see some of the film. The film is what can I call it? It's just 4 pieces of flesh. So you don't know whether it's a man or a woman whose backside you're photographing. And we put this together and we made a film out of it called Number 4. Almost every film school, someplace or other, shows film Number 4 as an abstract definition of filmmaking. As a matter of fact, when I've spent a lot of time in Moscow, and I went to the film school there, and they knew my name. And I said, how did you know my name? And they said, well, we used to show film Number 4 as the epitome of Western decadence. So if I was famous for anything, it was Western decadence. And that's because of film Number 4. There was recently an exhibition of it in London, because my daughter was in London and they had a Yoko Ono exhibition there. As I said, and I used to have John and Yoko, when I lived in England, come round and have dinner with me because of making this film.
I have one last question for you.
When was what?
What message? I have one last question for you. What message do you have for future viewers of this interview?
What
message
do I have? I don't know.
For future viewers.
As I say, being anti-religious is not the place to really. I used to, years ago, I have a letter from Spielberg, because I used to do all these interviews with survivors in Toronto. And I got a very nice letter saying, I did about 15 or 20 of them. And that was my only contribution towards the Shore Foundation. The trouble is, I think in another 100 or so years, students are going to be told they want to write their master's degree or their PhD on anti-Semitism. And where are they going to look for this kind of background? And they're going to have to look to the Shore Foundation to see it. Unfortunately, the Shore Foundation, as I said, has only used survivors. And they've had, like yourself, survivors asking the question, which I disagree with. I think if you're going to do a history of anti-Semitism, you have to have somebody who's not sympathetic with the situation. I think they should have had people that are divorced from the situation asking the survivors questions, because the questionnaire, the people asking the questions sometimes got involved in what was going on. There's a sympathy between the two. I always think that the survivors are going to want to look for independent. I mean, if I was making a movie on ex-Nazis in Germany, I wouldn't have ex-Nazis asking the questions on survivors of Nazism and fascism, right? Because it would be unfair. And this is what I think the Shore Foundation should do, is the questions, as I say. There was a very famous historian, British, he was a professor, did a story on Nazism. And again, it was very well done. So this is, as I say, it was a pity that this had to happen, because, as I say, in 1,000 years' time, people want to know what the roots of anti-Semitism is, and they're not. The roots on. I don't think any child is born with being anti-Semitic. They go into it by their parents teaching them, and they've been taught by religion, because then when they get religion, anti-Semitism comes into it.
Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Can you tell us, please, about this picture?
Oh, this is on a picture when I was very young called Tawny Pipit, and I am a clapper boy. You can see me there. That's me with the board. And it's Alan King was a very famous Hollywood, he's in there somewhere, which I can't see him. He's behind the camera. He was a very famous cameraman. As a matter of fact, when they had the Oscars, they mentioned his name when he died. But that's on this film, Tawny Pipit.
Okay. I need to ask your full name, sir.
Philip Pendry.
Okay. And it looks like there's a date on the picture. Is
Yes.
that 1942?
42, yes.
And that's in the UK.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Can you please tell us about this photo?
1942 in the Cotswolds. I'm 15 years older, on a film called Tawny Pipit. I had originally seen them in Welby filming there. That's when I joined the unit, and I stayed with them, and I was working I'm in the lower right-hand corner, 15 years old, holding a clapperboard.
And your name, sir?
Philip Pendry.
And this is in the UK.
Yes, in the Cotswolds.
Thank you. Please tell us about this picture.
Philip Pendry. This is in Yorkshire, and the person is in the foreground is a very, very famous film director called Anthony Asquith. You see me just in the background there, as I was 15 years old, and we're stationed at a Air Force station up in Yorkshire. And as I say, he was, and the film was called The Way to the Stars.
And can you tell us what year this was?
Again, 1942.
Okay. Thank you. Please tell us about this picture.
Philip Pendry. This is in the same film called The Way to the Stars, and it's in Yorkshire. It's in 1941. I'm right in the middle of the picture. It's the whole crew there. everybody, the director, the electrician. I'm sitting next to a woman and wearing a kind of an American fighter's coat anyway. Again, I was only, I think, 16 and living in an officer's mess and drinking.
And this is in the UK.
Yes, in Yorkshire, a place called Halfpenny Field.
Thank you.
Philip
What's this?
Philip Pendry as a sergeant in the War Crimes Commission is taken in the mountains near Hitler's, where he had his houses there. But there you see my sergeant stripe.
Is that near Berchtesgaden
Yes, it's near Berchtesgaden.
in Germany? And what year was this taken?
Oh, this would be 44 or 45.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1. Sorry, stop.
What's about this picture?
Oh, go. Philip Pendry. I'm there in Germany, Bad Oeynhausen, and that is Major Mant, the pathologist, in the foreground, and me standing in the background.
And when was this taken?
1945.
And where exactly did you say it was?
Bad Oeynhausen in Germany.
Thank you. Thank you. And this now concludes the
Thing, yeah. He was a pathologist.
Okay.